This week, we're discussing various reference services needs for children and young adults. First, I want to look at specific issues and information needs identified by Library and Information Science for reference services to children and young adults. And second, I want to identify key resources for librarians providing these reference services. So, important to reference services for children and young adults is defining who fits into these categories. Within library and information science and studies, children are identified and defined as persons from birth to age 14, or often from infancy through junior high school. Young adults are defined as people from 12 to 18 years old, or middle and high school students. And there's an intentional overlap within these age groups, just depending where they're at developmentally. Reference services to children and young adults constitutes a significant portion of reference work for general librarians and especially young adult and children's services librarians. Reference services has been impacted by the recent educational reform movements towards inquiry-based learning, and it often relies on active learning. So rather than giving information directly, reference services now encourage librarians to co-construct knowledge with their young adult and children patrons. So this means essentially teaching children and young adults on how to find materials or how to answer a question rather than directly just giving them the answer. Reference services to children and young adults typically occurs in both public libraries and school media centers. And for reference for children and young adults, information literacy is often key with this move to the digital age. So this idea of the Google generation, or for many young adult and children, they're likely to go to the internet. Researchers have found that 87% of people between the ages of 12 to 17 are now online. So for reference services to children, all reference services to children must be contextualized to that child's developmental stage. So it's important for children's librarians to have two types of skills, cognitive and affective. For children's librarians, cognitive skills provide for competence and qualification in fulfilling children's information needs. This is essentially about knowing different child development stages. Affective skills enable the librarian to respect, understand, and empathize with the needs of young people. It's also important that children's librarians respect and acknowledge agency within children. So often children's reference questions are imposed by adults, such as a teacher or a parent. And adults often also act as agents for children and impose children to ask particular questions. But reference librarians can sort of turn this table around by acknowledging the child, looking into the child's eyes, and working with them to produce an answer. Information service to children is central to libraries. Young children's information needs tend to be overlooked. So oftentimes local curriculum might help librarians be ready for questions that children that are going to ask, that might be imposed by a teacher. So a librarian might study local curriculum. The internet has also made a big impact on reference services to children, more than any other technological advance. So reference librarians are advised to use particular search engines for young users. So they can try Safe Search Kids by Google, or it can try Kids Click web search. And these searches have children's filters, and they also help children learn how to do a website search. Children's reference librarians have to adhere to the Children's Internet Protection Act, CIPA, which requires that libraries receiving certain types of federal funding implement an internet safety policy. Now, there's some controversies to be aware of. Some filters might filter out certain children's and young adults' information needs, such as LGBTQ websites, which might talk about sexual health. And so because they have the metadata and the language sexual, they might automatically get filtered out of these kids' search engines. So that's just something to be aware of as a librarian. The children's librarian also conducts a reference interview. For the children's reference interview, librarians should listen for the silent and unasked questions. They should take an open and friendly demeanor. For imposed query from teachers or parents when children are bringing questions that they've been assigned from school, librarians might need to prompt for more information and maybe even ask to look at the assignment with the child. Oftentimes, the reference interview might happen from the desk all the way to the source. So the librarian will bring the child over to the book that they're looking for, the print source, if that's the case. Reader's advisory is also part of children's reference. Librarians should know the collection well and should have specialized training in library materials for children. And also be an active reader of children's literature. There's also instruction for children in the use of libraries and materials. So individual instruction can take place in both public and school libraries in demonstrating how kids can use the library materials. And it can also happen during the reference interview, so the librarian can discuss the questions during the reference interview and explain the tools to find the answers. Next, we have reference services to young adults. Young adult reference services require some differences than children's services. There's some access to adult-level materials as well as materials within the children's collections. Some common models of services to young adults include information services, ethics and confidentiality, reader's advisory, and the reference interview. Within information services, oftentimes librarians find that young adults are also imposed to ask questions that are school-related. So what's important within the information services is to teach students how to do quality website searches and to create instruction programs that teach students to locate and evaluate information independently. Librarians can also generate what's called reference pathfinders, which are such tools as flyers or libguides, different ways that they can provide this information to teens that will help them essentially find the materials they're looking for. Within ethics and confidentiality, librarians in public and school libraries may be viewed as a trusted counselor and must be aware that they're often going to be keeping confidential information for young adults. However, librarians also need to be aware of the legal issues that surround needs and the treatment of young adults. Librarians will also be conducting reader's advisory interviews. So there's various book lists and annotated bibliographies within YALSA and the Assembly on Literature for Adolescents that librarians can use to provide various YA materials. And finally, there's the reference interview. Research has found that teens are often unfortunately treated as a problem patron by many librarians within the library. So it's important for the librarian to greet a young adult with kindness and to be friendly and open to that young adult. The librarian must, within the reference interview, determine the user's actual need. So sometimes their young adult might be hesitant to provide information on what their actual information need is. If this assignment or the question is school related, the librarian can follow up by asking to see the assignment further. RUSA and YALSA provide guidelines on how to work with young adults in reference services. They also provide information on designing collections, programming, and spaces for teens. The guidelines for YALSA and RUSA are to integrate library services to teens into the overall library plan, budget, and service program, to provide teens with courteous and professional customer service at every point, to use the most current information and communication technologies, the connections that they use on a daily basis to provide information to teens, to provide and promote information and resources appropriate to both curriculum and leisure needs of teens, to provide library services and programs appropriate for teens, and to cultivate partnerships with community agencies and groups serving teens. There's many resources for reference services to children and young adults. There's the RUSA and YALSA website and the Young Adult Reference Committee. There's the RUSA's Guidelines for Reference Services for Teens. There's the Reader's Advisory YALSA book list. So YALSA has a book list that librarians can use for such things as Reader's Advisory, and they also have book awards to promote these quality materials. For Reader's Advisory, there's also a Lawn Online, Assembly on Literature for Adolescents of the NCTE. There's also Novelist, which also provides a sort of book list for young adults. There's the Association of Library Services to Children. And finally, there's the International Literary Association and the Center for Children's Books in both Illinois and Wisconsin. So all of these resources provide various ways to lead librarians into quality reference for young adults and children. So in this lecture, we reviewed information on reference services for children and young adults, and we looked at some reference resources.